day to all the participants. Today is day 6, 27th November 2021. And here I welcome you all. And today I have a special person for all of you. Young, dynamic reader in physical geography from Bath Spa University in United Kingdom, Dr. Richard Johnson. And he's going to share with you his ways of conducting fieldwork with students, pedagogical skills, and also the fieldwork which you can conduct with your students in an online mode too, which he had conducted and used it so often during pandemic. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Johnson, for sharing these videos with us. I am Seema Mehra Parihar, who you all know by now. I'm your convener of this refresher course, and we are on to this day where I'm sure you all are learning new skill sets. Dr. Richard Johnson is so humble. When I requested him for sending me some material and sharing his thoughts on fieldwork, which he expertise on, he said, like, he's busy. But still, the moment he heard the name of Dr. R.B. Singh, he said, sure, I'll do it. He says, dear Seema and colleagues, I have this morning had the opportunity to produce the material you requested for your upcoming program. These are drawn from my existing materials, and I feel you all will benefit from it. Title of his talk is Virtual Fieldwork, Topographic Monitoring of Hillslopes, Failure Sites in the neighborhood, Newton Park, Bath Spa University, United Kingdom. And as I've always been telling you all these days, that you've not only to learn that academic skill set or that academic material that that person is contributing, but you also have to learn how that person is behaving, the way he's managing himself. And he says, please, I don't need that token honorarium which you're offering me. Please give it to any student or even delegate who would benefit from this. Thank you, Richard. We'll talk about it. And he wishes this course a great success. And of course, I also am very grateful to Richard the way he writes. He writes, I continue and quote him, Namaste. Greetings everyone, a warm hello from me. I am Dr. Richard Johnson, a reader in physical geography from Bath Spa University in the United Kingdom. I talk to you with several hats on, that of geomorphologist, the director of the Hazard, Risk and Disaster Research Group, and also acting head of our Department of Geography at Bath Spa University in the United Kingdom. I continue to actively undertake research on mountain floods, landslides and disaster risk reduction, governance in the Indian Himalayas, especially in the Kullu district of Himachal Pradesh. This research is very valuable and enriching experience undertaken in partnership with Indian government agencies, local communities and universities, including the University of Delhi, with whom we shared a recent and successful UGC UKRI research project. And DU and BSU are continuing to build our partnership activities via our recently signed MOU. He further goes on and says, I also cordially invite you and your students to join HRD's free online research lectures, which have a strong South Asian focus. More broadly, I thank you for the kind invitation to take part in your program. It's a real honor. And wish you all a very successful learning endeavor. I also wish to take a moment to reflect and record the great privilege and opportunities I was afforded to work with Professor R.B. Singh in recent years. So this is a very small contribution to recognize his influence, expertise, leadership, and dedication to geography, both in India, but also as a global scholar. Hence, I warmly support this dedication of this program to our shared memories of Professor R.V. Singh. We continue our partnership with DU Geography, working very closely with Professor B.W. Pandey and other faculty and colleagues. Professor R.B. Singh, we all miss you. And he's actually sharing with us his recordings, which he's done in last 2 years during full lockdown for COVID-19. And the virtual tool which they used was Blackboard. And I remembered that this tool was something which I used when I went for my postdoctorate fellowship at ITC Netherlands in 2001. And there, it was a recent new contribution, Blackboard. So all of you, what we all need to do is, we all need to appreciate the pedagogy. We all need to appreciate the tools. We all need to say that the fieldwork is so very important in geography. And he also shared with us 2 videos, where part 1 is the one that deals with theoretical part. It's a more theoretical introduction to Hillslope instability process and monitoring. And that's something, which we definitely would appreciate for. And part 2 is an introduction to the Newton Park landslide at Bards Spa. Just to remind us that theory and practical and application goes hand in hand. And so you all need to definitely remember that when you are watching these videos, my dear participants, you definitely need to reflect that particular platform too. You definitely need to find out, and you definitely need to work that are there any merits and challenges of online learning? Second, how can you promote and integrate field-based approaches to learning using measurement tools into your geography teaching activities? Can Google Earth provide useful contextual awareness of a site? And finally, as we hopefully transition to a post-pandemic scenario, what components of virtual delivery do we wish to retain and enhance in our future approaches for teaching and learning? What I basically want you all to remember when you are interacting with this particular way of learning, I want you all definitely take a note of 3 things. Number 1, is it possible to teach fieldwork via online learning platforms? Can we find ways of conducting fieldwork in the near neighborhood? And this particular videos are basically guiding you towards it. We all have geomorphology in our course, but the most important that I definitely want you all to definitely remember and make note of, because my experience when I was collecting and finding out the way the field works and the way geomorphology and the way that teaching is happening, are we doing it with that rigor? Are we doing and teaching our students something more than what's written in a small particular book? Are we showing them those physical features? If we are teaching them fluvial geomorphology or we are teaching them any other part, are we taking that rigor on or not? And sometimes you may also find that you have removed few things. Chain tape, do we have it in our curriculum now? Or we have forgotten those particular small surveys which we thought are now not very important. But always remember, basics always remain, even when we are conducting fieldwork. Enjoy these 2 videos. learn from them, make use of them, and also at the same time, remember that you all also have to find people with whom you all can collaborate and learn and move ahead in your learning ways and add value to all those things with this new education policy is advocating for. Good day, enjoy this video, and good luck.
Namaste. Greetings everyone, a warm welcome from me. I am Dr. Richard Johnson, a reader in physical geography from Bath University in the UK. I talk to you with several hats on today, that of a geomorphologist, the director of the Hazard, Risk and Disaster Research Group at Bath University, and also acting head of our Department of Geography at Bath University in the UK. I continue to actively undertake research on mountain floods and landslides and that of disaster risk reduction governance in the Indian Himalaya, specifically in the Kulu district of Himachal Pradesh. This research is a very valuable and enriching experience, undertaken in partnership with Indian government agencies, local communities, and universities, including that of the University of Delhi, with whom we share a recent and successful UGC UK area research project. DU and BSU are continuing to build our partnership activities via our recently signed MOU. I also cordially invite you and your students to join HRD's free online research lectures, which have a very strong South Asia focus, details of which you can see on the cover slide. More broadly, I thank you for your kind invitation today to take part in your programme. It's a real, genuine honour, and I wish all of you a very successful learning endeavour. I also wish to take a moment to reflect and record the great privilege and opportunities I have been afforded to work with Professor R.B. Singh in recent years. So today, this is a very small contribution to recognise his influence, his expertise, his leadership and dedication to geography both in India, but also as a global scholar. He will be sadly missed. Hence, I warmly support the dedication of this programme to our shared memories of Professor R.B. Singh. Indeed, from that foundation, we continue our partnership with DU Geography, working very closely with Professor B.W. Pandey and other faculty and colleges at the University of Delhi and further afield. The lecture materials I've shared with you today were recordings of a lecture I delivered early in 2020, and that was the time when the UK was in a full lockdown for COVID-19. And as such, we were very much at the beginning of our journey in adapting to virtual and blended learning tools. So to say a little bit about the lecture I have shared with you today. Firstly, it was delivered using our virtual learning tool called Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. And it is without doubt a little rough around the edges, as together we were still learning how to use the software. Thankfully, of course, we are now a little better at online delivery, but it is also true to say that we all continually learn together. Furthermore, the audience of the lecture were first-year undergraduate geographers, and the purpose of that lecture was to provide an introduction to Hillslope instability processes and the monitoring of that process activity and their consequences. And this was a precursor to a coursework assignment that used historical data which were derived from the monitoring of that active landslide complex at our Newton Park campus in Bath. And that lecture was supported by extensive learning materials, for example, videos, links to online literature sources and references, Google Earth movies, and also wider support in the use of Microsoft Excel as a calculative tool. And components of this are shown in the part 2 video. So to say a little bit more about the materials I have shared with you. So I've shared with you a component of the whole, and I've split it into two primary parts. Part one is really more of a theoretical introduction to Hillslope instability in terms of processes and the monitoring of those processes. Part two is an introduction to the Newton Park landslide at Bath Spa University, and also it explores some of the supporting online materials that were shared with the student cohort at the time to support their learning. And this is through our online or virtual learning environment, which we call Minerva, which in essence is a Blackboard-based software. And this was to replace the inability for that student group to visit the site in person because of the wider societal restrictions due to COVID. So it was a virtual replacement for our normal teaching delivery. So at the conclusion of the videos, once you've had the opportunity to watch them, perhaps you may wish to reflect in terms of your own teaching and learning approaches and experiences. And I pose to you 4 questions. 1, what do you think the merits and challenges of online learning are? 2, how could you promote and integrate and champion field-based approaches to learning using a variety of measurement tools and field apparatus in your specific geography teaching activities? 3, could you use Google Earth to provide enhanced contextual awareness of the sites that you wish your students to look at? And finally, number 4, as we hopefully transition from our COVID scenarios to a post-pandemic scenario, what components of virtual delivery do we wish to retain or indeed enhance on the basis of the experiences that we've gone through the last few years? And how can those assist our future learning and teaching approaches? So in conclusion, I once again wish to thank you for the opportunity to participate in your program, albeit remotely. And I actually wish each and every one of you every success. So thank you. The slide of photographs of some of our technical staff and some former dissertation students. So the photograph in the top left-hand corner is Matt, and Milo going from left to right. And there were 3 dissertation students who started and assisted with the design, the implementation and the construction of the various monitoring equipment on the Newton Park landslide. More about the details in a moment, but what can you see in the photograph? You can see the construction of an enclosure, a wire fence enclosure, for obvious reasons, because they're giving a beady-eyed look in the bottom right corner to protect the weather station. So we've got a set of instruments that enable us to measure a variety of meteorological and hydrological variables on this site, the processes that might be driving the change at the site. In addition to that, you can see in the middle on the right-hand side a total station. So it's not just about looking at the processes, it's about trying to understand changes in the Hillslope morphology, its form. So really today's virtual field trip is to replicate an understanding of this site and some of the measurements that we could undertake at the site. And because we're providing you for your assignment some data that have been previously collected on the Newton Park landslide that you can process in Microsoft Excel and start to think about in the context of some of the wider issues that we'll explore this morning. So that's where we're going. So just to reiterate for those who joined late, what we're going to do is say something about hill slopes in a reasonably non-technical fashion, but we shall see as we go. And that requires us to define the features we're talking about, in particular hill slopes, to look at the form, in other words, their morphology, their shape, their patterns, and how that might change through time, in particular in response to processes. So in geomorphology, we're particularly interested in that interplay between processes, things that drive change, how they modify materials to result in changing landforms in space and time. So I need to say a little bit about processes that might lead to and modify these hill slopes. and then say a little bit about, well, why bother? Why is it important? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about landslide monitoring in general terms. So this sets the scene for the data that you will be given in the assignment and what you can do with them. Of course, that assignment relates to the Newton Park landslide. So it's not land which is owned by the university. In fact, it all is owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, but this is a tenant farmer's land that we have consent to work on. And indeed, we've been working on since 2013. So this is part of a long-term monitoring strategy that is used for dissertation work in particular. With regard to the materials that we've already shared on the notes. So we won't necessarily look at them all in detail. We'll look at selected materials, but they're there for you if you were to undertake this assignment. And at the outset, I think it's important that I repeat that if you're undertaking a physical geography pathway, either the Italian garden assignment or this one on Newton Park is compulsory to you. If you're not undertaking the physical geography pathway, you have alternate. So let's dive in straight away and say something about these environments. Always let's start with some definitions. So I'm going to read these to you, and in doing so we'll pick out some key words that we obviously need to focus on. So let's dive into Michael Summerfield's, formerly the University of Edinburgh, as text about geomorphology. And he says slopes constitute the basic element of the land's surface. And so it is not surprising that they have long formed a focal point for landform studies. The main emphasis is on the characteristics and behaviour of valley side slopes or hill slopes, which extend from drainage divides to stream channels, although much of the discussion is also relevant to other kinds of slopes, as those along coasts. So in this definition, straight away, we're getting an idea of where they are in the landscape, the boundary conditions that define the beginning and end of a hill slope, and typically we're talking about inland terrestrial slopes. But of course, he's starting to open up the can here and saying there are other locations where we can define slopes as well. Let's move on from that and look at the Encyclopedic Dictionary of Physical Geography. And this gives us a little bit more breadth. So it's a word with two applications in physical geography. First of all, in a general sense, it is used to refer to the angle with which any part of the surface makes with the horizontal datum. So slope can refer to angle. However, our interest in it is the more the geomorphological angle, and this is slope refers to any geometric element of the Earth's solid surface, whether above or below sea level. So clearly another dimension there. Slope elements thus form entire landscapes. In a more restricted use, the term is often applied to escarpments and valley sides, of which the Newton Park example is other nearly horizontal elements. To avoid confusion, the more explicit word hillslope is in common use. So let's distinguish between slope and hill slopes. But of course, a hill slope still has a gradient if it is not horizontal. Hill slopes are regarded as three-dimensional forms produced by weathering and erosion with basal elements which may be either depositional and erosional in origin. So this definition is telling us again where they are. It's talking about the distinctions in the terminology and how it can be used in multiple ways. It is telling us about it's not just a two-dimensional profile, but it's also a three-dimensional attribute as well. So why am I drawing on these textbooks? Because I want to make a point to you that in your university degree studies, BBC bite size is a no-no. Wikipedia is equally a no-no. Not that we don't all look at them and use them, but the point of is you are reading for a degree. You've got to stretch your boundaries. You've got to push yourself. So textbooks are really your foundation, your first tier in that journey, and you need to then build by looking at journal articles. So we're starting to get an idea of what a slope and a hill slope is. So they are obviously key components of the Earth's landscape, be they a side of a hillside, be they a submarine escarpment in the ocean or a sea cliff. And in looking at that, clearly they occur at different scales, either of different size, but the one that we're particularly interested in is a segment on the side of a hill. because they're common features of the Earth's surface in different ways. And therefore, as a geomorphologist, a physical scientist, we need to understand what they look like, in other words, their characteristics, and how they may change, how they may operate, in other words, their behavior. And scientifically, as a geomorphologist, we're interested in this study of the Earth's surface and how that surface changes in space and time as a function of its starting condition and how its materials vary as a function of the processes operating on it. So we're looking at this interplay between, as you can see in this diagram, processes, things that impart energy and change and modification, upon the materials, and those could obviously be soils, they could be rocks, they could be organics, etc. And that ultimately leads to a landscape feature, a landform. And there's a constant interplay in space and time between your process, your material, and your consequent form. And these are two-way relationships between. So it's quite a complex maze, if you like. But of course, today, what we're interested in is the form element, the morphology, the shape, the pattern of that hill slope, and how it's varying as a consequence of the material of which it comprises and the processes operating on it at different points in time and in different locations. So let's pull that into more realistic terms and less abstract. You can see on the diagram a schematic, a model of a hill slope cross section. You can also see the smaller component, a planform view. So on the right, we have the small planform view, i.e. looking from above. On the left of the diagram, we have a cross-sectional profile, i.e. we're slicing through the cake, if you like. What's relevant here is that green line, that green surface, if you like. At the top of the hill slope, they're typically convex, they stick out. At the toe of the hill slope, they stick in, they're concave, typically. But that's a generalization. That is the common profile of a hill slope, and it all relates typically to hill slope hydrology, which I won't go into today, but it's about where the erosional and depositional processes typically operate in a temperate landscape. Different environments, different climates, you get different forms. So that green profile line going from top to bottom is effectively the same as the solid red line in the planform view, because what we're observing there is a line, a set of measurements being taken along that red line from the catchment boundary to the drainage line at the base. So this is a two-dimensional representation of a hill slope. And the data that you will be given for Newton Park are exactly this. They're a 2D representation of that slope profile. The difference is that you have multiple slope profiles and you're trying to explore how they change in time and space as a function of possible process controls. So on that diagram to the right, you can see effectively you've got a distance on the x-axis, the horizontal, and you've got a distance, a sort of an altitude or an elevation change on the vertical y-axis. And again, those are the data that you will have to process. As we said, it runs from the drainage line, the drainage divide to the actual channel in the toe of the slope. But of course, the actual characteristics of that profile are quite complex. They're not just as simple as that schematic diagram conveys. They reflect the vegetation growing on that surface. They reflect the nature of the materials. Are they rock? Are they soils? Are they hard? Are they soft? Which affects the extent to which they're erodible. Are there animals in the field that are modifying that surface? So we start from this general modeled simplistic scenario, and then we have to explore the reasons for the greater complexity which reflects reality. So let's try and unpick, even in a modeled context, that complexity, because you need to understand these complexities to appreciate reality. So a three-dimensional modeled scenario. So in this diagram, effectively we've got two surfaces. So if we look from above on the horizontal axis, we can provide a model geometric shape, And equally, we can do that on the vertical axis, i.e. the grey shaded component. Add those two things together, you get a whole number of different possible morphological forms for a hill slope. And even these are just points on an interval scale. It's an infinite scale of complexity. And these are just possible permutations of segments on that hill slope. Why on earth are these shapes important in the three-dimensional context? Why? Because it influences the direction of water flow, both on the surface of the slope, but within the soils as well. So typically, if you get water that is being forced away, so if you were to move, I don't know if you can see the mouse. Can someone tell me, can they see the mouse moving or not? Okay, I presume not. So if we go to the middle row on the left-hand one, so if we were counting across, it would be the fourth box in sequence. You can see there it's convex outwards. So if water was to fall at the top of the hill slope and it was to run down the surface face of the hill slope, the water would diverge. It would move away from the center. Conversely, those that have got concavities in the axis, so the bottom row, the water is going to be funneled and directed inwards. And that then leads to a concentration of water and a saturation of the soil. So hill slopes with concavities build up areas of saturation in the water, and that's more likely to lead to instability. And that is indeed a landslide. So hill slope shape influences processes, and those processes then influence the change in the shape. So you're starting to see the interaction of these process and form relationships. So let's move on. So what we're talking about with regard to the Newton Park landslide in the broadest terms is a mass movement. So let's define what we mean by a mass movement. This is the downslope movement of slope material under the influence of gravitational force of the material itself, and without the assistance of moving water, ice, or air. That's not to say those other things don't get involved, they do, but the principal failure of the material is geotechnical. It relates to the behavior of the material, response to stresses and strength factors. It's about the mechanics of the material. So, of course, there are multiple modes of hill slope failure, which we will come on to. It doesn't happen in one way. And a landslide is one of those various ways. We define that as a mechanism. The different modes of failure are called mechanisms. So the term landslide describes downslope movements of soil and or rock under the influence of gravity. Whilst many landslides do occur through the process of rock or soil sliding on a distinct surface, this is not necessarily the case, and thus the term can be something of a misnomer. So the point and debate I'm making here is many people refer to slope failures, irrespective of mechanism, as landslides. It's the term that you would frequently hear in media reports. It's in common use in society. If we're being more technical about this, and we're distinguishing the mechanism and the processes more specifically, mass movement is the collective term and not landslide. Landslide is a subcomponent of mass movement. So hopefully that is clear enough. And how is that manifest? Okay, so Mike Selby says we can distinguish these different mechanisms, these different modes of hill slope failure, according to a variety of characteristics. Firstly, how quickly that failed material moves. So for example, hill slope creep, where individual particles are moving, we can be talking millimeters per year. Conversely, the other end of the spectrum, an avalanche, be that snow or earth materials, or a flow of material that frequently involves a large percentage of water, are high velocity. So you get different velocities of displacement of the material from very slow to very quick, reflecting different materials and how they're actually failing. So of course it mentions material there. We'll come onto that in due course, but in essence, we're talking about rocks, soils, organics, and anything else that is applied to those surfaces, and they behave differently. They have different engineering properties, and that affects how they change. Mode of deformation. Deformation is a pre-failure change in the materials. So certain materials, when a force is applied to them, they're quite brittle. They'll snap they'll fracture quite suddenly. Conversely, other materials, let's say like a piece of elastic, they are able to deform without failure up to a certain point, and then they fail. So they have some plasticity, and therefore earth materials behave in different ways. Upon failure, how that material then moves, it also varies. And this refers to the geometry, the shapes and patterns and processes of how that material is moving. Does it move as a whole, or does it disintegrate? Does it break up into bits, or is it pulsed? So again, we can look at the patterns and shapes and positions of that material as it fails. Another factor that we would need to bear in mind when we're looking at Hillslope failure is the amount of water. Water is a significant control on the stability of slopes, but I'll end it there and we'll come back to that in due course, in particular in the second year, but I'll say a little bit more today. The consequence of this complexity, this reality, this variability is that we obviously have different mechanisms of failure. And as a technical, not because classification is a means of total understanding, far from it, but it's a template, it's a starting point with which we can start to appreciate these variabilities and some of those differences. Why bother? Because different understandings of different processes enables management to be focused on the specific scenario. So this impacts cost and it impacts life and death. So it does matter. So what I'm showing you now is one of these classifications from the US Bureau of Transportation, of which there's various iterations over the years. It is one of the more common classifications. So what can we see in this diagram? Horizontally, you can see a variation in the material type going from rocks to soils, and again within the soils there's subdivision according to the particle size. Is it big chunks or little chunks? And then going down vertically, the type of movement, I was speaking about different mechanisms and I was starting to articulate those. So here we've got falls. A fall is where the failed material fully detaches from the location, its parent location. So it's falling through the air. So a rockfall process is how you would visualize that. A topple is where we've got a pivot. And I don't know if you can see my hands at all. Can people see my hands?
Yeah.
Okay. So a pivot, the bottom of my hands, the particles remain in contact. So it is rotating around a point, and that is a topple. But eventually that pivot point stops and it falls away. Relatively rare mechanism, but I'm aware of examples in the UK and certainly other places as well. A slide mechanism is one of the more common mechanisms. So this is where we're talking about landslides in specific rather than generic terms. As you can see me, which I wasn't necessarily aware of, we have our parent bedrock and we have overlying materials. Can we see the diary and the phone, folks? I presume that's yes, because I can see nothing other than PowerPoint. Okay, so on a slope, it's an inclined plane. There comes a point when the stresses on the phone are so much that the frictional forces keeping the phone on the diary are overwhelmed, and then the phone will eventually slide. That is a slide mechanism, and the key issue there, or the failed material, remains in total contact with the underlying material, or at least significant contact. In other words, there's a shear plane, there's friction between the parent material, which has not failed, and the overlying material, which is failing. So that is a slide mechanism. And indeed, the Newton Park mass movement is a landslide type of mass movement. Lateral spreads typically occur in clays. We won't go there. Flows are high velocity pulsed movements, not indifferent to a flood in a river channel, but the actual mechanics are very different. But they are a high velocity, typically linear focused event, and a complex modes or multiple types of movement. So what do those actually look like? Okay, so what we're looking at here is some models, they're schematics of what the morphology would look like with different types of failure. But this is not all types of failure. I'm just taking a few. And the one within the red rectangle is what is referred to as a translational failure or a slab type of landslide. That is effectively the type of failure that occurred at Newton Park. It's a very simple mode of failure where the overlying material fails along a relatively flat failure plane. And we'll unpick that a little bit more later. And of course, around that red rectangle, you can see other modes of failure. And again, these are all typically landslide type modes of failure, but not exclusively. Some are spreading and some are flows. But the consequence of the different mode, and hopefully you can see this clearly now, is you get different morphologies, different patterns, different geometries of failed material, going from quite smooth and rippled to things that are more jumbled and rubble and debris-like, to others that are more elongated, like flows in the bottom right. So mechanism really matters to understand the features and, of course, then manage them. So this next schematic, this next model starts to define some of the key terms and the key processes that we would recognize in a failure. Now, I'll say at the outset, the failure plane, what's labeled here as the surface of rupture, i.e. that arc at the bottom, your shear plane here is curved. If I go back a slide, you will note that the Newton Park failure plane is not curved, it is flat. So this model refers to a rotational landslide, not a translational landslide, but it still has features in that are relevant to us. So at the general level, at the top of the landslide, i.e. to the right side of the diagram, at the top of the hill slope, we have a zone of depletion or a source zone. That's to say where the material is coming from. To the bottom of the landslide, i.e. to the right of the diagram, sorry, the left of the diagram, we have a zone of accumulation, which may or may not be a depositional mode. So we've got a translation, a movement of material along a pathway from a higher elevation to a lower elevation, typically under the influence of gravity. Within that, in terms of landslides, the key features that you will observe in the Newton Park data, even on profiles, is you can see a headscarp, which here is labeled as a crown. That is the very top of the landslide. You'll then possibly see some very subtle steps, and these are the scarp features. So they look like a staircase. And then towards the zone of accumulation, you may get, if you like, a compression. So what we've seen at the head of the landslide is an extension, a spreading of material under tension, so it's pulling apart. Compression, the material is going together. So it's all about the mechanism of that displacement of that material. In the case of the Newton Park landslide, we don't have deposition at the toe of the landslide. We have compressional ridges where the material is actually going into itself. So that gives you a sort of an overview of the principal features. You'll also see something at the top of the landslide labeled as crown cracks. These may otherwise be known as tension cracks. So a real indicator of failing material, a predisposing indicator, and something to look out for on ground which might be near failing, could save your life, folks, are tension cracks. So these little wedges in the ground, they're indicators of pre-failure. But anyway, we will continue. So when it comes to understanding the mechanisms, the mechanics, first thing I will say to you is they're highly complex, but we're not going to go there. It's an engineering discipline. We're geographers, we're geomorphologists. That requires us to at least have an opening understanding of the concepts, and I will look at it conceptually with you here today. Equally, increasingly, to look at the mathematics, which we will not look at, so rest easy. And the principal concept here is something known as the factor of safety, and it's merely a ratio, conceptually, between those things that are promoting change and instability, i.e. trying to create a failure of the Hillslope material, and those that are resisting that change. So you can see in the equation there resistance over that of destabilizing. Put that slightly more technically, it's about the strength of the materials, i.e. that which resists the forces of change. So it's a relationship, a ratio between shear strength and shear strength. Why shear? Because we've already said landslides operate on a shear plane. There's friction between the two. So conceptually, when you mathematically work this out with something called the infinite slope model, and again, I won't go into that, it gives you a number. The bottom has a range. If it is less than 1, we would term it as actively unstable. In other words, it's highly likely that Hillslope has already failed or should have failed. If it has a factor of safety between 1 and 1.3, it's marginally stable. And that is to say, it has the capacity to fail when transient, i.e. changeable forces modify on that Hillslope. In other words, it's ripe for failure. It's near the point of failure. It doesn't guarantee it will fail, but there's a probability that is the case. A stable Hillslope has a ratio in excess of 1.3. In other words, the shear strength characteristics far exceed the stress characteristics. It's unlikely to fail. I need to stress, just because you have these numbers doesn't mean the landslide materials are going to behave exactly as that classification suggests. They're indicative rather than absolute. So that's how we would start to understand the processes in very collective integrated terms on a hill slope. On a hill slope is this transition, this potential journey from a condition of stability to that of which we have got a failure, in our case a landslide. And it's got to go through this journey of stability, marginal stability to active instability in conceptual, i.e. theoretical terms. And to do so, we've got to modify that relationship between strength and stress, and preparatory processes enable us to do this. And there comes a point when they're really ripe for failure, in other words, they're marginally stable, but we've got to tip them over the edge, we've got to push them over that cliff, metaphorically speaking. And those are triggering factors. So what we'll do now is just say a little bit about what those might be. I'm going to show you a series of diagrams that express these things in different ways. So they overlap. They don't necessarily use the same words, but they're all getting at the same thing. How can we modify the Hillslope strength-stress relationships in order to make it ripe and precipitate a failure? So here's one diagram. And if we start on the far left of the diagram within the box, it's outlining those system level controls at a macro, i.e. a large scale level, the things that are going to precipitate processes that will lead to change. So tectonics, sea level rise, shifts in environment, so climatic changes or short-term variabilities, modifications in vegetation, which obviously affects evapotranspiration and other processes as well. What is the underlying geology which impacts the material and its properties? What's the overall morphology or topography, which has many implications geomorphologically, and anthropogenic activity? These then precipitate or lead to, or at least enable us to recognize and classify a suite of processes, be that weathering, erosion, interventions that lead to excavation of materials, which can either add or remove strength to a slope, vibrations, that could be an earthquake or it could be mining, or modifications in water. And we already said at the outset, water is a significant factor, especially in temperate climates like our own. The consequence of those processes in space and time upon those materials which exist on a hill slope leads to the changes that you can see in the final box. It can lead basically in raw terms to modifications of the strength or strength of that hill slope material. And again, we could go into each of those in a lot of detail, but let's keep this general for now. This next diagram from Mike Summerfield specifically relates some of those processes and their impacts under the banner of shear stress and shear strength. So it's doing exactly the same. It's talking about how these things modify the preparatory and triggering factors. And just go through a few. Shear stress, removal of lateral support. So if you were to dig a soil pit, and I'll show you photographs later, you've got a void, you've got a hole, and therefore the sides of that soil pit are no longer being buttressed or supported, and therefore they can collapse. Another example, church, cathedral, using medieval building technologies. You'll frequently see on the external walls pillars, which are known as buttresses, and they're vertical columns that extend up the side of the wall. They're there to give lateral support. Otherwise, the mass of the roof on the side of the walls would cause them to splay outwards. And again, that's all about lateral support. This is exactly the same here in Hillslope materials. Underlying support, the classic example would be waves at the toe of a cliff. And those of you who elect to undertake the geomorphology and environmental hazards module next year, we'll go to Lyme Regis in Dorset, and we'll see a real world example of how over time and space the removal of underlying support can lead to mass instability. Loading of slopes, people throw their garden waste onto slopes, and I've worked on landslides in North Yorkshire where a significant issue was locals throwing their garden waste over the garden fence onto a coastal landslide, and it didn't do it the world of good. But different story another time. Lateral pressure, freezing and swelling of materials. We know that the transition between phase changes leads to expansion between that of water to that of ice, and again this impacts adds forces to soils, causing lateral pressures. Transient forces, things like earthquakes. The other side of the coin, shear strength. Things that reduce the inherent starting strength. It breaks apart the structures. It changes the structures in chemical, physical, and biological domains. And that therefore weakens the material, which means the overlying stresses are able to exploit that weaker material. Poor waters is merely, in general terms, without going into detail, is about how much water exists in a soil column. Basically, more water, more stress on the surrounding materials. And we'll skip the remainder, but you're starting to see how these processes in a material modify how strong that is, its strength, or increase or reduce the stress on the material. Smith and Petley, a classic environmental hazards book, put this in simpler terms, but again, you can see all this together. Things that are causing modification or preparation would be weathering, changes in slope angle as a function of lateral or total tables, and vegetation. The actual final triggers, which can be the same processes, incidentally, relate to something called positive pore water pressure. Let's just call it saturation of the soil. Seismic activity and people digging things typically, or loading things, or using explosives, they don't help. Okay, we're going to finish this lecture. It'll probably take about 10 minutes, then we're going to take a little break. So just as a bit of relaxation and context, I'm hopefully now going to play you segments from these 4 videos. And the reason is they give us some context to process, material, form, but also why on earth are we using our time to do this. So I'm going to come out of PowerPoint, hopefully, and I'm now going to try and play these videos. Okay, before I start, can you see this YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to skip to about, this is a USGS video about the Northwest Coast. And I'm going to skip to about 4 minutes because it gives us some context to the reasons why this matters to society.
Both shallow and deep. We have a combination of steep slopes, weak rock.
Okay.
The San Francisco Bay Area actually is an ideal habitat for landslides, both shallow and deep. We have a combination of steep slopes, weak rocks, and very intense winter rainstorms. There are 2 different kinds of landslides in the Bay Area, debris flows and deep-seated slides. The debris flows are relatively small, they're shallow. They occur during periods of heavy rainfall, but they can occur quite suddenly and move very rapidly. If traffic movement makes them very dangerous, they can not only destroy property, they can actually kill people. The deep-seated landslides, on the other hand, are larger, deeper, and tend to occur more slowly and gradually and move more slowly. So they're much less dangerous to life and limb, but they can still cause an enormous amount of property damage. And there are certain geologic formations in the Bay Area that are notorious for spawning landslides. For example, in the East Bay Hill, we have the Orinda Formation. Some of its members are quite weak, clay stones, and when they get wet, they can begin to slide. On the San Francisco Peninsula, the serpentine areas or greenstone areas are notorious for deep-seated landslides. Here in the Santa Cruz Mountains in La Honda, there's a very young marine formation called the Barisma Formation, and it's quite weak. It's relatively uncemented sands and fairly weak clays. In fact, you can snap off a big piece relatively easy, like a big cookie.
So, I still can't believe it. My parents bought this house about 5 years ago. It's the retirement home. We repainted last year, put the green shutters on. The interior's been all fixed up, new floors. My mother's quite a garden. The whole area is garden. You can see what's left of the garden. It's just, she loves gardening. They put everything they have in this house. It's a $400,000 home. The insurance will pay $2,000 for moving expenses. So basically, that's it. The house will probably never be retrievable from this state, and they'll never be able to build on this lot again because this is no longer a probable slide area. This is a definite slide area. One geologist said it's a very slow-moving slide, that the house probably will not go down the hill or slide down the hill, but basically will continue to do this drop, lift, and slowly tear itself apart where it'll actually collapse in on itself. So that seems to be paying out. You know, this Bill's house, that's exactly what it's doing. There is a slow movement down the hill with Bill's, and there's a slow movement with my parents down the hill. But it's like maybe an inch, 2 inches a day. It's mainly this drop and lift, which is the biggest motion that we've noticed.
Deep-seated landslides can be very large. Deep-seated landslides can cover tens of square miles in some places. The landslide here on Scenic Drive in La Honda is a relatively small landslide by geologic standards, but of course it has tremendous impact on the people that live here. There are about 10 houses involved in one way or another, and a number of other houses around the edges of the slide. But the slide is relatively small, maybe 7 to 10 acres. The landslide is slowly moving downhill under the influence of gravity, like a thin slab sliding downhill. It's slipping on a weak plane at its base, which we've recognized about 25 to 30 feet below the surface of the slide. And it can move up to feet per day, potentially for months, depending on the amount of water in the slide and the steepness of the slope. The body of the landslide is deforming internally as material slides down the hill. It rumples up like a rug. It breaks apart like the bread crust on top of a rising loaf of bread. And as it advances down slope, it starts to rise up and over the pre-existing landscape.
The anxiety is, I guess, where will it stop and when will it stop?
When the slide began to happen, the fissure had not crossed over this empty lot yet, and people's houses were beginning to slide, and then day by day we would watch that fissure coming across the lot, probably a few inches at a time. And we did.
Okay, folks, I'm going to move on to the next video, which tells us a little bit about process, but hopefully from that just snippet, you got a flavour of some of the mechanisms, the managerial responses, but equally why it matters to people, and I think that's terribly important here. Okay, so this is about monitoring of processes. It's just an Indian example. Again, can we see this?
Many homes were damaged and destroyed in the Antonia Colony landslide in July 2005. Munnar has experienced multiple landslides in its history. Many lives have been lost, many buildings have been damaged, and a significant loss to the economy has occurred as a result.
അതിൽ മരിച്ചവർ ഒന്ന് ഇവിടെ മാത്രം 4 പേരുണ്ട്. ടൗണിലെ 2 പേർ, ആകെ 8 പേർ മൂന്നാറിൽ മരിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. മരിച്ചവരുടെ ഇതാണ് ഫോട്ടോസ്.
2 other landslides occurred on the same day as the Antonia Colony landslide and were also triggered by heavy, sustained rainfall. Amrita's wireless sensor network for landslide detection is deployed in Munnar, Kerala. Munnar is a popular tourist location in Idukki district. It lies within the high range of the Kerala portion of the Western Ghats and is almost 1,500 meters above sea level. It is located around 250 kilometers from the Amrita University campus at Amritapuri. Climate conditions are frequently cloudy and overcast with high rainfall. The European partners of the WindSub project visited in June 2009. Amrita University system is comprised of a number of sensor columns. The sensor columns are solar-powered and employ geotechnical sensors which are buried under the ground. The data is then aggregated and combined at the Field Management Center, which then transmits it through the satellite network to the Amrita University campus of Amritapuri. The data is then analyzed, stored, and streamed to the website. The deployment site covers 7 acres and currently includes 20 sensor columns, 20 wireless network nodes, and around 50 sensors. Amrita's wireless sensor network landslide detection system has been featured in several leading Indian newspapers.
இந்தியாவில் இது முதல் டைமா வந்திருக்குன்னு கேள்விப்பட்டோம். அது இந்த அந்தோனியார் நீங்க கிடைச்சதுல எங்களுக்கு நிறைய சந்தோஷம்.
நன்றி. அமிர்த அம்மைக்கு வளர நன்றி.
Okay, folks, again, it gives you some context to why value to society, but the reason I played that video is it demonstrates a monitoring strategy. And again, Newton Park has a similar set of approaches, albeit not online, but we have to go and talk to it if you like. Right, the next video.
This is forest fire early detection system prototype project. For this, we need following components: male to female connecting wire.
That shouldn't have happened, but let's not worry. Onwards. Okay, the form, and this is using a laser scanner. And again, we've used VSU's Leica laser scanner to do very similar things at Newton Park. What it showed, that's a very different story, typically growing grass. But anyway, here we go. Okay, so what you observed in that short video was a laser scanner. It's not indifferent to the total stations that you will eventually get to use. It measures effectively distance, angle, and in this context also takes a photograph. So each pixel has an X, Y, Z value, but also an RGB, a color value as well. Now, a total station does it one point at a time. It measures a single point. And the profile data that you have for Newton Park have been taken using a total station. A laser scanner measures tens of thousands of points each second. In a reflectorless, Newton Park is a slightly older version now, but that still measures 50,000 points a second. So some of our measurements of Newton Park, rather than being sort of 50 or 100 measurements with a total station, the TLS data, the terrestrial laser scanner data, we're talking tens of millions of measurements. So a different scale of observation. And again, you can employ different tools. And so from those measurements you saw in that video, digital elevation models, which were shaded with a color ramp, i.e. different colors. So you could see the variation in the morphology over time. So they're quite a powerful monitoring tool. And I'm going to play you one more video now before we take a quick break.
My name is Jonathan Chambers. I'm a research geophysicist with the British Geological Survey, working with a geophysical tomography team and other teams across BGS. This is the Holland Hill research site. It's an active landslide. At the top of the hill, we have Whitby Mudstone Formation. So it's a weak, weathered mud rock. This is slipping, failing, overriding more competent sandstone below. And what we're doing here is using cutting-edge ground imaging technologies to characterize the structure of the landslide and monitor processes occurring within the landslide.
My name is Phil Meldrum. I work as a research engineer at the British Geological Survey. This is the heart of the system. What we have here is the alert system. This is the automated time-lapse electrical resistivity tomography system. What this allows us to do is to do remote monitoring of sites. The system itself collects electrical resistivity data from sensors which are distributed across the hillside. Measurements are stored locally and then telemetry back to base via a GSM network. The system operates 24 hours a day and is powered from a battery bank, which is enclosed within here. The batteries themselves are charged locally using a wind and solar array. The aim was to allow for remote monitoring, which is unattended monitoring, to take out the need for repeat surveys, where you have to actually send people into the field, into remote locations, which takes time and effort.
Okay, so this is live data that came in fairly recently from the site. What we're seeing here is a range of colours that indicate the resistivity of the materials beneath the ground. My name's Paul Wilkinson. I'm a theoretical geophysicist specialising in electrical methods, working at BGS. This is these warmer colours here show where the sandstone is, and the cooler blues, they indicate the mudstone, which is slipping over the sandstone, and we can see a thin layer of the mudstone here, and this is the material that's sliding at the site. But if we put this into 3D visualization package, we can see the results a bit more clearly. So here we've got a combination of some of our reconnaissance surveys and also the 3D block here. This is alert data from the site. We're zooming in on this now. And as we fade this out, we're going to see a contour. This is the interface between the slip material, the mudstone, and the sandstone, and it shows us the extent of this and also the depth, and it does this throughout the whole volume. It complements the sort of traditional survey techniques that we use in BGS.
Landslides are a real problem in that they're a hazard to life. So we're doing two things here. Firstly, we're seeking to understand what's happening at this site in terms of why we're getting landsliding and ground movement, and what the structure is of the landslide. But we're also seeking to develop this cutting-edge technology for wider applications and for use on other sites, so that other people can benefit, if you like, from technology that BGS has developed. This is the culmination of several years' work, and it's everything, if you like, that's exciting about science at BGS, working with a large team of people, a range of specialists, to solve complex geoscientific problems.
Okay, folks, hopefully I'm now back and you can all see me. Is that the case, Kerry?
Yeah, all good.
Excellent. Well, the purpose of those videos was not to think, oh my God, what is he talking about? It was just to demonstrate the principles and why we would bother, and the fact that we need to understand the material, which you saw in the last video, the processes, which you've seen in multiple videos, and the forms. And some of those techniques have been employed at Newton Park, but you'll be only taking a slice of the data from that activity. So what we'll do now is we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll come back about. So let's resume. Okay, so I'm now going to go back to PowerPoint, and let's pick up from where we were. Okay, so we're now talking about the mass movement, which is a landslide at Newton Park. In the Minerva materials, there are a number of Google Earth movies there's an on-the-ground movie, there's some associated materials, which we'll take a brief look at later, but let me just give you a little bit of context first of all. So the red dot represents the approximate location of the failure site. So place that in context. You can see the two lakes to the northwest. You can see main house as the arced building approximately in the center. And if you go to the left, you can obviously see where Corston building in the castle is as well. So it just gives you some spatial awareness. That entire hill slope going between Newton St Low, which is slightly cropped at the top right, all the way towards Stanton Prior. If you were to look at a geological map, you would actually see evidence of multiple historical landslides, which of course are now to some extent invisible in the landscape due to change over time. But there is clear evidence of failure in these periglacial materials over the last 10 to 15,000 years. But of course, we're talking about a contemporary, a recent failure of this hill slope. But when we start to look at these sites, it's deeply important we place it in some historical context, because we're not talking a natural landscape, far from it. We're talking a highly artificial, the Newton Park estate in about 1790. You can clearly see the avenues of trees. You can see main house with orange building in the center and the lakes to the north of that. You can also see the Italian garden and the castle, so you can sort of locate where we are today. So it clearly was part of some estate land which was managed. And we know this landscape was heavily manipulated. There were drainage systems, there were trees, there was cut and fill operations, indeed the lakes were created. So the materials have been heavily modified at the ground surface, and that affects their characteristics and their strength. Towards the present day, this is just after the Second World War, and indeed if you look very carefully, where you can see the scrapes in the photograph, there's a small aircraft actually at low altitude flying along. You can see main house, you can see the drive. You can also see a curving track north of the drive, which is actually an artificial drainage channel which has now been removed. And that's the approximate location above that of the landslide. And clearly there are more trees in the landscape than there currently are. But you can clearly start to see that it's not always had the same land use. And again, that affects the surface material properties. Far more recent, you can see before in the bottom right of the photograph, it was a car park and a hockey pitch and so on. But you get the general sort of setting, and you go towards main house, take the drive towards Newton St Low, and to the right of that, you can see a pattern in the field. Clearly, they're growing crops. So it's not always had the same land use. We've seen a variety of land use, from estate land for the grazing of animals to that of arable crops, which clearly impacts the surface soil layers. We've had trees planted, we've had historical drains. It is a heavily modified landscape, and the landslide has occurred in that setting. Current day, obviously, this is what you would typically see if you were to walk up to that field, cracking view of the campus and the surrounding countryside. Fewer trees, quite a few cattle are always most entertaining. So here we're standing at the top of the landslide looking down slope. North is to our right hand side looking down slope. Now we're looking up slope. You can see two principal features. In the foreground, you can see a compressional ridge at the toe of the landslide where the ground has buckled up. Beyond that, you can see mid slope a scar, a sort of brown linear line. That's the headscarp, and the ground in between is all the failed masses. And beyond that, you can actually just see on the horizon a small enclosure, which is where all our hydrometeorological instruments are. So this is now a map from one of the student dissertations in 2013 when we established the site. So just get your bearings. The campus is to the far top and left of this. The Met station is the rectangular square enclosure in the bottom right. The headscarp, i.e. the top of the landslide, are the brown triangles pointing in a northwesterly direction. The toe of the landslide, same symbol, obviously towards the base. And then on top of that, we've got a map showing the variety of monitoring instruments. And so you're aware they include the Met station, which is measuring a range of hydrometeorological parameters. It involves these red lines, which are particularly important to you, which are the axes of the survey lines. The blue dots are what are known as dip wells. You've got little wells all over the landslide that enable us to measure the water level. Then others are just basically ground markers for the surveying, be it with the total station or the terrestrial laser scanner. So the monitoring strategy was looking at the hydrometeorological processes. It was looking at the morphology, i.e. the shape and the pattern of the ground surface across the landslide, both downslope, which is profile 1 and 2. So the top of the hill is the bottom right, the base of the hill is the top left. In addition, there are 3 profiles going across slope. So they're giving us a 2-dimensional slice of the morphology, whereas the terrestrial laser scanner gives us a total 3-dimensional depiction. So we're using 2D and 3D survey technologies. Your assignment merely relates to profile 1, 2, and 3. So I'll be clear about that, profile 1, 2, and 3, even though I'll give you data for all 5. So if we happen to be there on the field trip, we've used this site numerous times with our student groups on other modules to undertake some of these hydrometeorological monitoring exercises. And of course, we can't be there for very, very unfortunate, but obviously reasons that you fully understand. So if we were to go on that landslide, which again you can see in the background behind the group of folks, you'll be using the total station. And this is a Leica builder, and it effectively is an electronic theodolite that measures angles, and also it measures distances, and it measures them on multiple planes, both horizontally and vertically. Basically a series of lasers and clever mirrors and lots of mathematics it does for you, so we say thank you very much. But in essence, you're zapping a laser beam at a reflector, and this is what the reflectors look like. And it's by zapping a laser, it's then returned from the reflector back to the total station, and that enables the measurement via time to look at distances and angles. And those are what we need to derive our X, Y, Z coordinates. X and Y are horizontal and vertical, and or horizontal, I should say, and Z is the vertical or altitudinal axes. So what can you see in the picture of Flo there holding the survey staff? Well, you can see the students have established a survey line. They've set out ranging poles at the very beginning and end of the survey line. There is some green garden twine, so they get a consistent axis between the beginning and end. And then there are a series of tapes that enable them to determine their distance along the profile. The actual distance values you have are derived from the total station data. But in order to position the reflector at a consistent distance, they needed something on the ground to guide them. So that it's there as a guide rather than the actual measurement. Why does this matter? Because we have multiple time series of the same measurement along the same axes, i.e. the same profiles. And your data will show you that. Same location, but a different point in time. So we needed a consistent methodology. And in effect, they measured or took a measurement using the total station every 2 meters along that profile, with one exception. And that's where there was significant changes in the ground surface, which were typically the headscarp at the top of the landslide and the compressional ridge at the toe of the landslide. Why does all this matter? Why do we want to monitor change? Because we're seeing if there is any significant change in the ground surface, i.e. is there a reactivation, a further sliding of this landslide, which occurred between Christmas and New Year 2013. Short answer, has it moved after that date? Yes. And this photograph, or this series of photographs, are demonstrating to you it might look insignificant, but it's actually a tension crack. The ground is splitting apart. There's a wedge being created. And that wasn't due to drying out. That was a 30-meter long tension crack, about 10 millimeters width, demonstrating, albeit small, there had been a reactivation of the landslide in 2014 following the initial failure. So that landslide was actually marginally stable and became active again for a very short period of time. I'm not aware of any significant reactivation since. It doesn't mean it can't happen. Why? Because once the material has failed, the stress required to cause a new failure is actually a lot less. So the reactivation levels of stress are less. And monitoring is an important tool to manage the risk of these features. On that photograph, clearly you can see the runoff of water in the soil and the ponding of the water. And this reactivation occurred at a time of significant prolonged rainfall. We mentioned the terrestrial laser scanner, which you will not be using data from, but just for completeness, here you can see our TLS. And yes, that is Andy hiding under his fleece in order that you can see the LCD screen on the TLS. But I thought it was quite funny nonetheless. Sorry, Andy. We also not only look at the processes and the form, but we've had students in their dissertations look at the materials. Here they're digging a rather large soil pit to look at the stratigraphy, the layers of the materials, and take physical and chemical measurements. Had we not added lateral support, they could have been buried by soil and suffocated. So clearly there's a slight issue with health and safety. So these are things we take seriously in fieldwork. If you want a gauge of social distancing regulations and what 2 meters is, it's slightly above their head in that picture because it's a 2 meter rule. Just to put that into some more context for you, you can see the buttressing we're undertaking of the side slopes, and there's your 2 meter rule and the stratigraphy. And they dug about half a dozen of these, and they had the most amazing fun. So it just gives you a flavour of some of the techniques that can be used in physical geography to understand process, material, and forms. We mentioned the Met station. Here it is. It's measuring wind, rainfall, temperature, humidity, and water level characteristics typically. Again, I won't go into too many details. You will not be using the data from this, but again, just to give you that holistic context to the site. Yes, the grass does grow. Yes, we have to maintain it, and we can spend several hours cutting grass. All the joys of physical science. But it does give you something other than just the grass cutting opportunity, data. And from these data, and again, just a snippet here, you can see variability. So we're looking at 15-minute measurements here from that Met station. The green are 15-minute rainfall intensities, so clearly some heavy periods of rain. The blue is air temperature, I think. The black is the water level. And the horizontal axis is time going from November of 2017 to July of 2018. It's a US logger, hence it's in month, day, year format. And you can clearly see there is temporal variation in the processes. And so it's important that we look at the relationship between process and form behaviors. And again, you won't be looking at that, but it gives you a flavor. And of course, looking forwards, you still are doing your degrees. You still have to develop that skill, that expertise, and that excitement. And therefore, fieldwork is at the center of what we do. Of course, it's troublesome at present, but things will ease and we will move forward. And I'll say more if people are interested about the India field trip a little while. Yes, that's a picture from India. I always got a few of those. But I'm now going to play you this little video that demonstrates that students still do undertake work and they do adapt. And of course, we all need to be of that particular mindset. So fingers crossed here. Okay, so this is a video from one of my dissertation students. I've had absolutely nothing to do with the video, I will add, but it'll give you a flavour of how we can adapt our laboratory work at least. Okay, folks, I'm back now. I mean, the reason I played that video is several-fold. One, Sam was actually supposed to be undertaking his dissertation on the landslide, and of course couldn't, so he had to adapt. And the secondly, I think it makes the point to you that in science we have to be very methodical, we have to be sequenced, we have to plan, and we have to have numbers, and we have to compute those numbers. So there's a clear linkage to the exercise you're going to be undertaking here. So at this point, what I'm now going to do is we're going to have a brief look at the materials that I put on Minerva. I'm not going to go in them in a lot of detail, but I'll look at one or two. And Kerry's also going to speak to you a little bit about some of the sort of key attributes and key components of Excel. Is that all right, Kerry?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so I'll do Minerva first, and then we'll come briefly to Excel and we'll talk about the assignment. Okay, so in the teaching materials, I presume people can hear and see, is that correct?
Yes, it's very small, but you can see.
Okay, screen, so anyway. If we go into the virtual fieldwork, into the Newton Park landslide morphological change monitoring, you'll see effectively there are four components. There is a version of today's lecture, but obviously it's a CLA compliant version with things stripped out. But of course you obviously have the recording as well. There are three primary folders. One is labeled the formative. In other words, we're setting up exercises that enable you to get more understanding via some reading, but also doing some trial calculations with a data set that is exceptionally similar to the actual data you'll use for your assignment. Some of the additional materials are in the background resources, and we'll look at those in a moment. And there's the specifics of the assignment. But initially, I'm going to read the statement to you here. If you're a physical geography pathway student, you are required to write up either this landslide project or the Italian garden. And I've obviously spelt garden beautifully there, but not both. If you're a single honours student or a GDS student, you have a choice of all three projects. If you're a human geography student, of course, you either do the ethnography, I think you have to do the ethnography, or the Italian garden. Does that make sense to everybody about the rules on assignment selection? Kerry, could we just do a poll thing on that? Will I have to come out of this view to do that?
No, sorry, bad question, but give the right answer.
That's fine. You understand on the rules for assignment selection? Okay, good, right. So let's look at each of those folders 1 to 3. So in one, we've got some instructions that give you a worksheet, if you like, that takes you step by step through the logic, the calculation routines, and works you through an example set of slope profile data in order that you can produce some slope profile graphs in Excel. So it requires you to understand the mathematics, but equally the use of Excel as a tool. And I'll look at that sheet briefly in a moment. The next component is the trial data. Do not confuse the trial data with the assignment data because they're not exactly the same. Same site, but different time periods. So that's the first chunk. The second chunk, there's more in it, the background resources. So there's a sheet that's called Newton Park background information, and it's just a description of the geomorphology, the geology, and gives you some context to the site and the failure. Put together a Google Earth movie that takes you from the Corton building, takes you on that journey from our home to the landslide site. Andy very kindly, before the lockdown, went and did a little film for you that actually shows the site and shows schematically, not in absolute styles, and you can look at that yourself. If you want more information about the landslide, I've loaded 3 of the dissertations that pretty much talked about the morphology more than others. There are, of course, others. but it gives you some context and obviously some more references. Then there are a whole series of links to authoritative organisations' websites, the British Geological Survey, the United States Geological Survey, and again they give you some relevant context and informations. Then some of the ebooks that are available in the library which relate to geomorphology in general, to give you some context, and then landslide specific. So I would start with the general and then get a little bit more specific, and of course I've highlighted chapters that are most relevant to you. And then there's a bit more local information from Natural England about the landscape, and also whilst it is not Newton Park, it is another failure at a similar time that impacted the local road network and how they managed it. So again, it gives you a context. And if you wanted to know a little bit more about the total station procedures, so you've got that expertise, or at least in conceptual terms, Andy has kindly put together a few videos which you can see there. So I'm not going to go into any of those in detail, but it's there for you to have a look at. And the third component are the specifics of the assignment, and we will look at this. There's the assignment brief that says these are the things that you need to do, folks. That needs to be read and understood. Then there are the actual data that you will use in the assignment. But if you elect to do this, I strongly recommend you do the formative reading and trial data calculations ahead of the summative, because it will address many of the questions that you may have. It will give you that expertise, it will give you that confidence. So I'm now going to come out of this and then just look at a few of those documents, not all of them, then I'm going to hand over to Kerry.